Welcome on behalf of the Bethel Park Historical Society. Welcome to the our speakers here today on the JFK 60th anniversary assassination. You are currently sitting in the Bethel Park Community Foundation auditorium. As you know, this building was built. We're sitting at this section is actually built in 1905, and one of the things that the Bethel Park Historical Society is doing is we get never near the end of our renovations, but we want to return to its base of an educational facility. So, as I said, welcome to the Schoolhouse Arts and History Center. Our speaker today is longtime Bethel Park resident Dick Jewell. He has a varied career, a U.S. Army veteran, 3rd Armored Cavalry Division. He is a lawyer with extensive trial and corporate experience. He has also been a partner, vice president, director in 3 of the nation's largest forensic accounting and consulting firms. He has 2 segues into higher education. First, in 1988 to 1991, he was the University Trust Officer in charge of Pitt's 5 applied research companies and was a president of the Pittsburgh Applied Research Corporation, which operated the world-class research and development facility owned and developed by Gulf Oil, which was gifted to Pitt in 1986 by Chevron. From 2003 to 2014, he was the president of Grove City College, his undergraduate alma mater. He also, from 2015 to 2019, served 2 terms as commissioner of the Pennsylvania Gaming Control Board. Trained in history and law, he has over the years been frequent lecturer on topics related to American history and the American experience. He has presented over 10 different lectures, many times. One relates to the Kennedy assassination. There remains doubt about the responsibility for it over the past 6 decades. This afternoon, Dick will catch us up on the current thinking and analysis related to the darkest days of our nation's history. I will also note that Mr. Jewell, we have his yearbook, I did pull it out, is actually attended this school here and is a 1963 graduate of Bethel Park High School. So at this time, I'd like to introduce Dick Jewell.
Again, thank you, and it's great to see everybody here. Many of you I know, some fellow lawyers here, Bob McTiernan, good to see you. Representative Mihalik, responsible for $150,000 for this project here, and $950 for the splash pad, or pretty close to that, RCAP money, with state money coming back to really help the continued development here of Bethel Park. Dr. Jay Wells, Jay was my state rep a few years ago, and a good friend for many, many years, and a great dentist. We have Senator Devlin Robinson back there. I was Devlin's finance chair and still am. He's up for re-elect. We're not here for a political meeting. Re-elect this year is Natalie. It's coming year. Judge Arnone, I was his finance chair for his 2 runs, and it's good to see Ron. And Mr. Rosenberg, I'm glad you mentioned that his daughter was a good friend of our daughter's growing up in Bethel. And I still live over in Oakhurst, right down from Bethel Presbyterian Church and the cemetery, right down Marshall Road, where my family moved, when I was 11 years old. I'm now 78 years old, so I've been in Bethel a long time. And if I was up at the college and living up there, I'd always see Mayor Morton, and I'd remind him that my tax dollars, because we still owned a house here where we moved back to, were still being reinvested in Bethel Park. So it's great to be here. As Tim said, I have over the years really spent a lot of time doing different historical lectures. The last one that I gave, and actually the Daughters of the American Revolution were here this morning in their meeting, was to their annual meeting last fall, about 88 ladies and myself. I've never had so many ladies and no other gentlemen. And I talked about the Constitutional Convention and all the dynamic that went on behind that, something of great interest, of course, to them. But I do mostly lectures on the founders and on the Constitution and things like that. But there are 2 things that I got involved in I found very interesting, and one certainly was the Kennedy assassination. So everybody who was of age, that means you're cognizant, you remember, even if you're 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, or older at the time, knows where they were when they first heard about the assassination of President Kennedy on the 22nd of November, 1963. 60 years ago this coming week. I was a freshman at Grove City College. I was in the main reading room, but right around the corner of our library. It was afternoon, it was nice and sunny like this. It was actually very warm, much warmer than today, sort of like yesterday in the last couple of days. And I sat down after lunch and I was starting to work on some of my schoolwork, history in fact, and I was falling asleep. You know what happens after lunch, you've got to get a hold of yourself and you finally get into it and you're okay. And I could hear when I sat down kind of a buzz coming from the reading room, kids talking or moving around. Then I kind of got going and I'm studying. I can't see the reading room. A little while later, I looked up. I didn't hear any noise whatsoever. Just absolutely quiet. Kind of like Sherlock Holmes, you know, the dog didn't bark. Something's different here. I got up. All I had to do was take 3 feet back and turn around the corner, and I looked and the entire reading room was empty. No students there, where 50 or 70 students had been 20 minutes, half hour before. So I went down the middle of the reading room, kind of, you know, what the heck, and got to the one lady I could find at the checkout desk. I said, where did everybody go? And she said, oh, you haven't heard. I said, what? President Kennedy has been shot and assassinated. Well, of course, big shock. I walked out the front of the library and looked across campus. Those of you that have been to Grove City, you can look from that library straight down. Trees weren't as big then, and see the beautiful chapel, Harbison Chapel that we have. And the students were just streaming into the chapel. And so that was where I was, and each of you here could have the same type of recollection, and I'm sure, because it was incredibly memorable. We have had 8 presidents in the history of this nation who have died in office, 4 by assassination and 4 from natural causes. Natural causes were William Henry Harrison, Zachary Taylor, Warren G. Harding, and yes, Franklin Delano Roosevelt. We had that stroke that took him on the 12th of April of 1945. And we've had 4 that have died by assassinations. Abe Lincoln, obviously, we all know that one. James Garfield in 1881. The next was that put Teddy Roosevelt into office, William McKinley and John F. Kennedy. What's interesting of those deaths, both natural and by assassination, 2 of those that were shot in medical science today probably would have survived and continued serving. And that would be Mr. Garfield and Mr. McKinley. And of those that died of natural causes, the first 3, Taylor and Harrison, and the third one was Harrison, Taylor, and Harding, probably would have survived with medical assistance. The gunshots, though, especially to the head with Mr. Lincoln and Mr. Kennedy, could not be survived. But we would not have had as many folks turning over the office to the vice president by death if we had medical science today. The death of Kennedy changed a tremendous amount in the way presidents were protected. And so I'll just tell a brief couple of stories. It's 1960, and it's the first campaign in which I got involved doing handouts and going door to door. It's Mr. Nixon versus Mr. Kennedy. So my dad, and we're living right on the same street, Marshall Road, and my dad said, well, the way you do it, he says, you get the voter list. So we get the voter list. And he sits down and he goes through them. We're going through it. And Bethel in those days were mostly Republican. Until I'm looking at the voter list where I'm going to be going, and there's 18 Democrats all in a row. Nothing wrong with that, by the way, but 18 Democrats. This is unusual. Where did all these guys come from? And I said to my dad, I said, I can't understand how all the Democrats are in this one section. He looked at it, he started laughing. That was what was then the nunnery at St. Thomas More. They were all sisters, and they were going to vote for Jack. I did go up and visit them, by the way, and did hand out some Richard Nixon things. So in that campaign, Nixon decided he did not want to, he was going to do it on his own. It was going to be close, and it was. He was going to do it on his own, and he was not going to involve President Eisenhower getting out the stump for him. And Mrs. Eisenhower didn't want Ike out on the stump either because of his health. He'd had ileitis, he'd had a stroke, he'd had a heart attack, 3 major health events, negative health events, in the 8 years that he was president. Ike wanted to get out there. So finally, he and Nixon, he sat down with Dick Nixon. He said, Dick, I want to get out there. I'm going to do it, even though Mamie doesn't want me to. So he came to Pittsburgh late in the campaign with about a week and a half left. So I get on the trolley. Now, this is back in the days when 12, 13, 14, 15-year-old kids got on the trolley, the T we would call it today, all by themselves. We were free-range kids in those days. Free range. Mom and Dad, this is okay today, I'm not knocking it. Mom and Dad did not walk us to the bus stop and waited till the bus picked us up to go to school. No, totally free range. So we moved here when we were 11, and the very next day, Mom gave my twin brother, Paul, who just passed a year and a half ago, my best friend. Paul and I went to the Y downtown. The YMCA in those days was downtown on Wood Street in Pittsburgh. She gave us 40 cents each. That's 80 cents, 40 down, 40 back, and some money for lunch. And we started doing that, and within a year, at age 12, you could blindfold me, and I could walk around the city of Pittsburgh, knew exactly where it was, and I would. 4 days a week in the summer for the Y, and on Saturdays during the winter, and then we started to compete in swimming and diving and things. That was more during the winter, but other nights. So we got downtown a lot. So I get on the trolley, and I get down to Pittsburgh, and they had set up a riser with a big lectern on it for Mr. Eisenhower to speak, and it was right between the old Hilton Hotel. Now, all the hotels have the same hotels, but they have different names, you know. Some of them in their 5th iteration of names. But the old Hilton Hotel and Gateway 3. And they had closed any cars coming down off the bridge. And maybe 1,000 people showed up to hear Ike come in and speak on behalf of Mr. Nixon. I walked right up to the back of where he was going to walk right up to get on the stage. And there's no push away or protection. There was no checking for who's coming. There's no ways to determine if you had a weapon or anything like that. It was just, again, it was free range. And Mr. Eisenhower comes around the corner, and I did not shake his hand. I did Mr. Kennedy's. I'll tell that story quickly. But along comes Ike, and he's Natalie, as far as we are right here, and with a couple guys beside him, but that's it. 2 years later, Mr. Nixon loses, and Kennedy wins. And Mr. Kennedy's going to come in at midterm. It's the elections. And he's going to stump for Doc Morgan. Remember the guy who was the member of Congress down in Washington, Pennsylvania. And it's announced that he's going to come in to the Western William Penn Hotel, another name today. He's going to come in the back door. He's going to get there about 4:30. So my brother, a bunch of our buddies from Bethel, we get on the trolley, go down, and we want to see Mr. Kennedy. We stand in Mellon Park, and we stand right across the street, from what's the back side of the hotel. Sure enough, Kennedy comes in the same car in which he was shot, and stands up, and there's about maybe 1,500 people, and everybody's waving, and in he goes, and in he goes. But the next day, Saturday, it announced he was coming out at 10 in the morning to get in his car, and he's going to be in an open motorcade that went from the Moo Shops. Who remembers the Moo Shops? Moo Shops, right? Up on the corner of Fort Couch and Route 19, Washington Road. And he's going to be in an open motorcade right all the way down into Washington, Pennsylvania. So I'm in that morning for the Y, and I don't go. I just get on the trolley, and I go up myself to the back door of Western William Penn Hotel. There's 3 doors, 2 together, 2 and 2. So I'm over here on the left. And the sidewalk's about 12 feet across. And that's where the cars park. There's only about 25 or 30 people. That's it. So I'm smaller than I am now, and I could fit right in at the edge. And there was a lady in front of me, and all of a sudden the door goes around. The president comes out, now closer than you and I are. I can actually touch him. The lady pushed the sawhorse that they had there I came in behind her, 2 others came behind me, and we went out and walked with the president to the car that he was getting in, and he just said, you know, how do you do, shook hands, that kind of thing, and off he went. He is assassinated the next year. The next year, in 04, in 64, I'm in New York in the first week of August, and Mr. Johnson's coming into the Waldorf to speak to the annual ABA convention of lawyers. And, well, I happen to be there on vacation that week. I'll go up and see what that guy looks like. Good luck. They shut off Park Avenue back by 3 blocks, where he was to get out of his car 3 hours before. There were about 150 New York policemen, literally arm to arm, jammed like that would be a cordon that he'd walk through to go up into that back entrance on Park Avenue of the Waldorf. And helicopters everywhere. And then they just about shut the city down an hour before that. There was no way. And that was the difference. I mean, it was amazing. The significance of his death, and then we're going to get to the rationales, not rationales, but you know what happened or what may have happened. Well, in foreign policy, I only take one, and this is all conjecture, and we all have our own thoughts and conjecture, but Vietnam. Kennedy had been burned once in the Bay of Pigs, and he had been burned in a way that had been developed within the CIA, had not been looked at closely at all by the chairman of the Joint Chiefs or the Joint Chiefs, and that thing didn't work, as you'll remember. That was a debacle about 2.5 months after he'd taken office. So he was nervous about the CIA too, very nervous about that. And so I happen to think that Vietnam would not have happened the way it did. And it's pure conjecture, because when Diem was deposed and then assassinated in the 3 weeks before Mr. Kennedy was assassinated, he did not expect an assassination. And in removing Diem, they got one leader and then another leader and another leader and another leader, and things really went downhill from then. I think he would have played it, he would have gone to Vietnamization, which was Mr. Nixon's rationale to how to finish that war off with some modicum of respect on our part. I think he would have moved to Vietnamization much sooner than that and would not have committed 565,000 troops at one time to Vietnam. If that's so, again, conjecture, who knows, would have been a big difference, because Vietnam was a sociological watershed in modern history of this nation, where we began to doubt authority, began to doubt opinions of those who were supposed to have them, and started to turn into a nation, and I understand this, of skeptics, which soon became a lot of cynics. And so it did some harm. There's no question about that. On the domestic front, Kennedy had done something very interesting with Walter Heller out of the University of Minnesota, was his chairman of the Council of Economists, the President's economic advisors. And he had advised that the marginal tax rates be reduced, and be reduced significantly. Now, this was not necessarily a democratic theory, right? Tax and spend. Tax more, higher, it's great. Tax the rich, what have you. But Heller had done a lot of research and had convinced the president that more money would come in by actually cutting the marginal tax rate. And that actually turned out to be true. But he didn't get much of that until after the assassination, because Lyndon Johnson, and Robert Caro, in my judgment, is the greatest living biographer that there is in this nation. He's done 4 books on LBJ, and he's got a 5th one if he lives. He's getting old, right? If he lives on LBJ. And LBJ took a lot of Mr. Kennedy's things that he wanted to do legislatively for the country, and in Jack Kennedy's memory, got a lot of people to buy in, and LBJ was an incredible person to talk people into things, and got a lot of what Mr. Kennedy was trying to do passed, the Voting Rights Act, the Civil Rights Act, the more modern ones in the early 60s, and more of the Heller economic kinds of things done. So those things did get done, but it took Jack Kennedy's death for it to occur. So how did I get interested? Well, I'm in college at the time, and I did 2 major papers my senior year in college. One was a complete, with just one professor. I did an 88-page analysis of Oliver Wendell Holmes Jr., the judge, and then in Massachusetts, and then the justice for years in the U.S. Supreme Court. But for a small class, I also did a review of the Warren Commission report. And that's how I first got interested in it and took a look at it. And the Warren Commission report, of course, went to Mr. Johnson late September of 1964, about 6 weeks before the election, when LBJ was elected in his own right as President of the United States to his own electoral term. And by the time I'm a senior at Grove City, 66, 67, there had been the early critics like Mark Lane and some others that had popped up. So I had the benefit of some of the criticism to begin to take a look at it. And so I just got interested in it. And a lot of people in the country got interested in it. They could be anybody. They just like to read, and I said, well, this will be interesting. And there's a lot of information out there. And I think I'm going to look at it as hard as I can, read as much as I can, and then maybe come to my own conclusions. And that's sort of what got me started on that part of it. How has the passage of time, 60 years, really starting 30, 40, 50, 60 years, affected exactly what happened? Well, interestingly enough, it's affected in quite in many ways. One of the interesting ways that to me, the ear witness and eyewitness testimony, the best of that testimony is what was taken within 3 hours or the same day of the assassination. The ear witness and eyewitness testimony. Next, the records release. There are a lot of records that the federal government had and that they had embargoed. I think all but about 2 to 3% of those records have been released. It really got a push after the movie that Oliver Stone brought out in 1991 called JFK. And by 1992-93, in the early years of Mr. Clinton, there actually was passage of a law that provided for much quicker release of all of the information within the federal government purview of the records about investigations and things like that. And now all about 2% has been given out, and I think the last will be in another year or two. No smoking guns in all of that information. A lot of people expected smoking guns and people were hiding things, etc. But no, there's been, to my knowledge and what I've seen, there's been no smoking guns there. Also, what helped over time from when the Warren Commission conclusions came out was there's been both the critics, individuals looking at it, as well as federal government groups looking at it kind of seriatim over the years. We had the Ramsey Clark, who was the second Attorney General, actually third to Lyndon Johnson. He allowed 9 prominent physicians to go into the archives and for the first time to see the actual autopsy photographs of the president and to read the original autopsy records and to see the x-rays that were taken at Bethesda when Mr. Kennedy was brought in for his autopsy. We then had congressional committees. We had the Church Committee and the Rockefeller Committee group that took a look at a lot of things, including, and this was significant, the fact that we were trying to get rid of Mr. Castro during the period of time, for sure, leading up to Mr. Kennedy's assassination. That was not known at all. And in fact, if you remember, in the Cuban Missile Crisis, which was in late October of 1962, that was settled between Mr. Kennedy and Mr. Khrushchev when Kennedy had agreed in writing not to invade Cuba, had agreed, but not in writing, and as a secret part of the agreement with Khrushchev, that the United States would remove their missiles that they had put in Turkey, and that gave just enough cover to Khrushchev to pull back the arming of missiles with nuclear warheads in Cuba, and everything was undone and brought back to Russia. Nevertheless, they continued through the CIA, and Robert Kennedy was put in charge of the committee to get rid of Castro, now very quietly, very secretly, and a much more, not 2,500 troops landing on the shore, but using the mafia and that relationship to try to end the life of the Cuban leader. So that church committee especially did quite a bit on that. And then we had the House Select Committee on Assassinations. And Congressman Stokes of Cleveland, Ohio, headed that. And they took a very comprehensive look and relook at the assassination of Kennedy. And they looked at a couple of other folks, prominent folks who had been assassinated at the same time. But in many, many ways, all of the work that these government groups did looking at it again, trying to find holes in it and problems and trying to see if that was the correct conclusion. As a general proposition, there are some holes here, and I'll talk about them, came to the conclusion that there had been 3 shots, that Oswald fired those 3 shots. Conspiracy, hold the phone on conspiracy. I'm going to talk more about that. You remember the Warren Commission was set up within 2.5 weeks after the assassination of the president. Originally, Wagner Carr, who was the Attorney General of Texas, had said, we're going to review it here in Texas, because it was a Texas crime. There was no federal law against killing a president. The murder that happened in Dallas was a local Texas statutory crime, no federal crime. Of course, at Parkland Hospital, there was a tremendous dispute between the Secret Service and Kennedy's aides. They wanted to bring the body right away back to Washington, D.C. And Johnson had already gone out to the plane, was waiting a federal judge to come to swear him in, and he said, I want the president's body and Mrs. Kennedy with me. And so there was fist fights, dang near. Folks drew their pistols, and they literally spirited the president's body away from Dr. Rose, who was the coroner medical examiner, who was there saying, hey, wait a minute, you have to do an autopsy under Texas law here, and it's going to be prosecuted as a local crime under Texas law here. They got the body out, back on the plane, and back to Washington that night, a little after 6 o'clock. And then the body, of course, went to Bethesda for the autopsy. Let me turn now to another subject here. The Warren Commission, which was formed, I should finish this, in the late November, was Nick Katzenbach, who was the Deputy Attorney General of the United States. Bobby Kennedy was the Attorney General. He was in no condition to be working on this. He was grieving tremendously for his brother, the president. And so Katzenbach was the fellow who convinced LBJ that we needed to have a group of prominent, elected, a couple of them weren't, at the time weren't elected, folks in the country, headed by Earl Warren, the Chief Justice of the United States, to take a look at what happened and to come out with a report as to what happened. Because even in those early times, there was all kinds of theories going around. The Soviets had done it. The Cubans had done it. The Mafia had done it. LBJ wanted to be president. I mean, that was you can imagine all the different thoughts that were going on out there in the Commonweal, as we call it. And they needed to have somebody take a look at it and who had prestige and had the ability to have the confidence of the nation. So they suggested that they put together this commission. It was LBJ's job to get the folks to serve. The first guy he had to get was Earl Warren, the Chief Justice of the United States. Chief Justice Warren, no way did he want to serve on this commission or be part of it. We had a certain history with the Nuremberg trials with Supreme Court justices serving as judges and prosecutors. That had happened from time to time. But he was running the Supreme Court, an Article III part of our government. He's got plenty to do. And of course, LBJ, being the most persuasive of fellows, said to him, "Now, Chief," he said, "you have served your country before." And he said, "If your commander-in-chief asks you to serve again, are you telling me you would not do that?" It's exactly the words he used. Well, Chief Justice said, "If you put it that way, Mr. President, I'll serve." The next fellow that LBJ wanted to get on the commission was his greatest mentor in the Senate. Remember, Johnson had been elected to the Senate from Texas in 1948. By 1953, already, he had become the majority leader of the Senate. He was a very powerful fellow in that position, and he acted accordingly. His mentor was Dick Russell, the longtime senior senator from the state of Georgia. Dick Russell was a segregationist. He didn't like Earl Warren at all. Why? Because Mr. Warren had been the Chief Justice on Brown versus the board, and some of the early cases that began to reverse the concept of separate but equal and overturn the concept of what we knew as de jure legal segregation. He hated him. And Russell would not, he said, "Mr. President, I will not serve." And there's a picture of LBJ. He would do this with people. He'd put his nose, almost touching noses. "Now, Mr. Dick," he said, "I can't do this without you. You have got," he turned on that persuasion. And then he called him the next day and he said, "I want to congratulate you, Mr. Dick." He said, "We just announced you're going to be on the Warren Commission." On the commission. They called it the Warren Commission yet. "Mr. President, what did you do?" It's too late. It's too late. The ship has sailed and you are on it. I want to congratulate you, sir." And that's how Dick Russell got on it. John J. McCloy was added to it, the president of the World Bank. John Sherman Cooper, very distinguished Republican senator from Kentucky, was on it. Allen Dulles. Dulles was Secretary Foster Dulles' brother. He had run the CIA during the years of Mr. Eisenhower, had been the guy in charge when the Bay of Pigs went south, and President Kennedy kind of moved him out, but brought him back to serve in the Warren Commission. Caleb Boggs, the majority leader in the House from Louisiana, member of Congress. Cokie Roberts' father, if you remember Ms. Roberts, and all the years she was on TV. He came and joined it. And so they had, and a fellow who was the minority leader in the House, we'd hear more about him later, and that was Jerry Ford. So Gerald R. Ford served on it. So it was quite a group of, no ladies. We weren't looking at those things back in those days, should have been, but, the world had changed, it was different, it's changed now, it's good. But it was, the wise old men, we'll call them, and that's the fellows who served on it. They served from late November until it was delivered to the president, their report, 888 pages, the Warren Commission report, 28 volumes of depositions and exhibits and things like that was attached to it, and delivered to the president in late September, the next year of 1964. And here's what they found. 3 shots, Oswald. The first one missed. The first one hit. The second one missed. And the third one was the headshot. Later on, when we got to look at Zapruder film, and I'll talk about that at a much slower rate with scientific enhancements that were not capable in those days, it looks like the first shot missed, the second shot hit, that's the magic bullet, and then the third shot was the headshot. They also found that there was no conspiracy, very controversial, and I'm not sure they had to reach that, but they did, and that Oswald had acted alone. And by the way, they couldn't find a motive. So if you read 888 pages, I've done that 2 or 3 times, you can't find a motive. They did not find a motive. I think there is one. We'll talk about it. So that was the founding of the Warren Commission. The purpose was to put to bed a lot of this speculation so we wouldn't have to invade Russia or Cuba or tear apart some of our governmental agencies because of folks that hadn't been behaving themselves. And generally, it was quiet for about 2 or 3 years. Then the critics started looking at it in different ways. Some of the, Jerry Ford was probably the biggest defender of it, but some of the members later said, well, we should have tried to come up with a motive, but for sure, we couldn't say that it wasn't a conspiracy. That doesn't mean necessarily that there were 2 people shooting at the same time. That was ipso facto considered to be a conspiracy, more than one shooting at the same time. But it's possible that Oswald had been, and we understand this term today, don't we, radicalized by different things he'd read or seen. There's no internet, none of the things we have today. But we'll talk about Oswald, very interesting and strange guy. But there was a possibility there was radicalization, for sure, in my judgment, that had gone on there. And so, things now, the critics come, and we start to look at things. And probably the best way to look at what happened that day, actually happened, is to use a term you hear very often, but it's the right term. What's the best evidence? What is the best evidence from 2,000 books that have been written about this? Have I read all 2,000? No, but 2,000 books that have been written. A tremendous amount of speakers like myself, Dr. Wecht, others, you know more about Cyril Wecht here locally, have stood up and had their own views and opinion as to what happened. Now I'll tell you where I come out, and then I'm going to go through why. Even all these years later, I generally have come out and said the Warren Commission, I think, got most of it right, interestingly enough. They had the benefit of a lot of interviews, 525 witnesses interviews and depositions, 25,000 pages of FBI interviews that were made available to the President and to the Warren Commission, 25,000 pages of documents that they took into account. So they got a tremendous amount of information right up front and for the months that they were looking at it. The way they did the work, there were 7 commissioners, but they divided the work into 14 select areas. Who was Ruby? 2 lawyers on that. What actually happened when the shots rang out? And Arlen Specter was one of the lawyers on that. 2 lawyers on that. What was it that brought Kennedy to Dallas? 2 lawyers on that. So they divided it into 7 discrete areas and had 2 lawyers each that did much of the work. Probably the most important was actually the sequencing of the shots and what did happen. And that brought Senator Specter into it. He was a young lawyer, brilliant guy, and he had been interviewed and hired, and his boss, so they had a senior lawyer and a junior lawyer in each of these areas. And his boss was a lawyer from New York City named Adams, who was a very famous lawyer in antitrust. And Mr. Adams proceeded to have a monster antitrust case that he had to try in New York for months. He wasn't there. Arlen did all the work, did 95% of the work. Consequently, he was the only young lawyer that really was with Earl Warren and the top folks, as the big guys, so call them, big guys were, just because of that situation that had occurred. And as some of you know, just a couple maybe, I was Senator Specter's chief financial fundraiser in the West for 2 of his cycles. So I knew Arlen extremely well, really well. We exchanged books. He'd take my call on the same day if he was there. And we did have discussions on the single bullet theory. The single bullet theory is very important, but what creates all of this and the certainty of much of it was the Zapruder film. And we have a picture of Tim. There's a number of pictures here, but this one is helpful. That's the actual Bell & Howell camera that Mr. Zapruder used, standing on the pergola way up high, and that's very important, you'll hear that in a minute, way up high, and took the shots that we've all seen over the years of Kennedy coming around Market, Main Market, and then down Elm as he goes by the school book depository, and the shots ring out. He stood up on that promontory, and it was as high as this podium, because I've stood on it, and you have to climb up to get on it. It's hard to get up there. He stood up there with his secretary, who was sort of holding on to him, and more on where they were standing and the implications of that from the grassy knoll. But the Zapruder film is called the Rosetta Stone of the Kennedy assassination, and it truly is. It took 30 years for science to catch up with that film and to slow it down in unbelievably slow motion, and I have seen this. Super, super, super slow. Now remember, a movie, which he's taking, is just a picture, a picture, a picture, a picture, and it just goes real fast. 18 and a half pictures per second actually makes up the sequence of the Zapruder film. So they were able to tell from what they were seeing at what frame each shot or the shots occurred because of the reaction of those that were hit, including the first shot that hit nobody, but the reaction of Kennedy and a little girl and some others right on the side who stopped and looked over when that first shot missed, but had a huge sound as it came out. Ear witness testimony that day, 88% had three shots. 88%. That's probative. That's a significant amount. Only 2% said the shots came from two different directions. Only 2%. So you have 88%, three shots, 2%. But where it gets a little confusing, only 44% could say it came from behind. About 14% said it came from the grassy knoll. And there were a couple of other locations that people thought it came from. Because how many have been down in Dallas in Dealey Plaza? Okay. It's still big, it's still open, and you can get a reverberation in there. And it's exactly as it was 60 years ago. Kind of like Gettysburg. Have you been to Gettysburg? Gettysburg, in many ways, is very much like it was. And very, very few changes in Gettysburg over all the years since the Great Battle. So, 3 shots. That's very probative. Zapruder, about 30 years later, somebody was thinking about this, as a lot of people did, whose name was Luis Alvarez. Luis Alvarez was the only person in the history of this nation to get a Nobel Prize in physics and chemistry. But like a lot of people, he said, this is interesting. I'm going to think about it. I'm going to look at it. I'm going to read all this. And he did. And when he saw everything super up close, he said, can we slow it even more? And they got it slowed even more. And here's what he said. Natalie, if I gave this camera to you, okay, had you stand up, you don't have a tripod, so it's you, and you're filming as the president's coming down. And then I stand behind you over here, and I have, and I have a starting pistol. Remember those old starting pistols for swimming and track that had a blank in it, sounded just like a pistol, and the barrel was not open at all. And I said, now I'm going to fire that 3 times. You know I'm going to fire it. You don't know when, but you know I'm going to fire it. I want you to hold that as still as you can. In fact, don't move that, please. Don't move it at all. So they took the Zapruder film at super slow motion. They looked at the frames and the way people reacted, including the 2 that got shot eventually, not eventually, but in that sequence. And sure enough, boom, boom, boom. There was a jiggle. There was a demonstrative move when you got it to super, super slow-mo that Mr. Zapruder made when those shots were fired. That, too, is best evidence. And that is, I've always thought to be very persuasive. And that was science 30 years later. They couldn't do that initially. Now, where Zapruder was standing, and can we have the grassy knoll one, please? We have two grassy knolls, okay? That's the picket fence, and that's the grassy knoll. And now when we have the other one, because that's where... Okay? Zapruder was standing right here. See, although we're looking upwards, that's actually almost equal to this. Zapruder was over 6 foot. His secretary is about 5'5". When you're standing, and I've stood up there, when you're standing up there, and it was alleged that the shots came 5 to 8 feet down the picket fence right here. When you're standing there, I'm going to tell you this. Zapruder didn't move. He moved this way. But his secretary, you couldn't have missed somebody firing a rifle because you're looking right down into it. I mean, that's the only kind of original thought that I've brought to this. I've been at the assassination site more than 30 times. Now, I never paid for my own fare. I was a lawyer for a corporation in Pittsburgh owned by a Dallas company. So I was down there for a lot of reasons on business. And then in forensic accounting and law, and then at the college, there are a lot of folks down there you go collect money from at the college, right, for gifts. But I had a lot of business in Dallas. So about 30 times I was at that assassination site. And you stand up on there, as I did, as Zapruder and his secretary did. And they took her deposition. If she'd have seen that, she'd have said something. She said nothing. There was nothing. And I've looked at the deposition. Nothing. Couldn't have missed it at all. Usually I'm not that certain about anything because you shouldn't be, but I am about that. Now, where things got confusing was when the House Committee, Special Committee on Assassinations, at the very end of the 2 years' work, brought in folks that said, wait a minute, there was an open mic on a police, not cruiser, but a motorcycle, and we don't hear shots, there are they call them sequence sound impressions that could be shots, and in fact, we have 4 of them, and we don't have 3. And so the House Committee, the very last thing that they said was, it was a conspiracy, there was more than one shooter, ergo there was a conspiracy, more than one shooter, boom. And that was big news, as you can imagine. Except they came to that conclusion so quickly with third parties advising them that the National Academy of Science, within 3 years, put together 12 of the most distinguished folks in that area, and they had gone back and they had looked, and they came to the realization that the motorcycle that had the open mic was not in Dealey Plaza. In fact, it was at the Trade Mart where the president was going to present his speech after he'd gone through Dealey Plaza and out to the Trade Mart. And so that got shot down, and I think most people accept that today. So generally, I have accepted what I've read and heard and thought about over the time that the Warren Commission generally had it right. Oswald was a very strange customer, born in 1939, and a very sad story. He dropped out of school in the 9th grade. The school he dropped out of was his 12th school that he'd been in. He lived in 19 different apartments, homes, or places up until that time, between Fort Worth and Dallas in New York City. His father died 2 months before he was born. His mother had lots of challenges, I'm just going to put it that way, financially for sure, and in her cranium also, if I may say so. And so he had just a terrible upbringing. He had two brothers, a biological brother and a half-brother that came from the first marriage of Marguerite. And they concurred that Lee Harvey had a hard time. All three boys at one time were in orphanages that their mom put them in, part of that upbringing and living. So he never got an education, but he was a reader. He was a natural reader. And early in by 6th or 7th grade, for whatever reason, he started to read some of the original Communist Manifesto, all the information you could find out about communism and the alternate lifestyle, because he hated America so much in his life in America. He drops out in the 9th grade, hangs around doing menial chores, beats his mother. He also beat his wife quite a bit. He was a wife beater and a mother beater. That was a bad situation. And he joins the Marines when he's 17 years of age, the first day he can join. He's in the Marines for a 3-year hitch. He gets out a little bit early to take care of his mom, but he only takes care of her for a week. And within a week, he's on his way to Russia and defects. And he's in Russia about 3 years. When he's over in Russia, the Russians, he's over there on a tourist visa. And it runs out, and they want him out of the country. There's plenty of history on that I've read. They don't want him there. Because it's not clear who's going to take care of him, who's going to pay for him, The same kind of things we worry about here before we went to the open border world that we know today. So he proceeds to slit his wrists and try to kill himself. And they find him, and they save him, and they say, all right. So they send him to Minsk, about 450 miles from Moscow, to work in a radio factory. And there's no information whatsoever. He's not getting money from anybody. He's not on anybody else's payroll, meaning agencies in the U.S. or in the Soviet Union. And he meets a young lady, tries to marry her. That falls apart, and on the rebound, he meets Marina, the woman that he does marry, has 2 children with, and he brings her back from Minsk when he leaves to come back to the United States about 3 years after he had left. Now, this is pretty rare, for somebody to defect from the United States who was just in the Marine Corps. We didn't have a lot of folks doing that. We had about 18 defectors in that period of time. That's not many out of the millions of citizens we have in the country. And so he comes back to America. Why? He finally said to himself, America is a terrible place to be, but Russia's not any better. It's when you really get down, when the rubber meets the road, under either society, only a few people are in charge, and everyone else gets the shaft. This is Oswald's thinking. That's how he spoke. But he said, I'm really a Marxist. I'm not a communist, I'm a Marxist. I'm the purest philosophical type person about what communism is about. And that's what it's, and I'm always trying to find things better, but I've decided I want to go back to the U.S. and try that again. Comes back to the United States, comes to Fort Worth, and he gets to Fort Worth in June of 1962. Now, a lot goes on between June of 62 and the assassination of Kennedy in 22nd of November of 63. Oswald he would get a job, then he'd lose it. He would beat his wife some more. He would not teach her English. He did speak Russian, but he would not teach her English. They only had friends who were from the immigrant community, mostly Russians, in the Fort Worth, Dallas area. And the friends hated Oswald, and they felt real sorry for his wife. In the summer of 1963, after he's been fired from his second job, he goes to New Orleans. That's where his family was originally from. He moves in with his uncle, and he founds what he considered his chosen world. That was the Fair Play for Cuba Committee. Now it's Cuba. That's where life is the best under Marxism. Cuba is where I want to go. and he's handing out flyers, and he organizes the Fair Play for Cuba committee. And he makes like there's 30 or 40 members. There's only one, that's him. And it's all fantastic in his mind. And he's writing, Gus Hall and the communists in America, and the heads of the Fair Play for Cuba. There was such a place headquartered in New York, and he gets a nice letter back, and I mean, this just feeds him, and he's going to strike a blow, and he wants to get to Cuba. He decides that he's going to go from the latter part of September 28th until the 4th or 5th of October, that he's going to go to Mexico City and try to get into Cuba through Mexico and the Cuban embassy there. And those 5 or 6 days in Mexico is where everybody sort of lost him quite a bit. No, there's never been a clear explanation. Yeah, he went to both. He didn't get the visa. He was just so angry, and he finally came back. But there was a lot of assertions he was with some people that could have whispered in his ear or radicalized him even more about Kennedy or something like that. Don't have an answer for that. Nobody does. I've never read a coherent understanding of what happened in Mexico when he was there. He comes back. His wife was living with a woman who was a Quaker, and she was speaking Russian, learning Russian, and in her early 30s, and she took, she felt sorry for Marina and the daughter, and Marina now 8 months pregnant, 8 months pregnant. And so she had brought them to her house in Fort Worth to live there, while Lee went to New Orleans in the summer and then went to Mexico. When Lee comes back, Mrs. Payne, Ruth Payne is her name, one of her friends in the neighborhood gets Lee Harvey Oswald a job at the Texas School Book Depository. This was before it's known that Kennedy is coming to Dallas, and it was only 2 days before he actually arrived that the motorcade route was announced, and it turned out it's going right by the Texas School Book Depository. Oswald owned 2 weapons, a pistol and a Mannlicher Carcano 6.5 millimeter rifle. No doubt about it, he ordered them about 6 to 8 months before. They went to a false name in a mailbox that he had set up and came to him. And in fact, his penchant for killing, on April the 10th, 1963, before he had gone to New Orleans with the Fair Play for Cuba stuff that he was doing, before he came back, he decided he was going to kill Major General Edwin Walker. Walker was a prominent right-wing member of the Dallas community, a John Birch Society member, and he decided that it would be a good idea to take out this fascist. And he goes down and he scouts out his house. He went down the second time and he took the rifle with him and he hid it in the ground. And he went down the third time, took the rifle out, and on the 10th of April, 1963, General Walker, by the way, he's a 2-star retired general, who in 1961 had been the commander of the 24th Infantry Division in Berlin. But Kennedy, through the Joint Chiefs, had agreed to it, had fired him and retired him from service because he was handing out right-wing literature to his troops. That's a no-no, that kind of political work. And so he'd been fired, he'd stepped away, and he went to Dallas. And so he was getting ready to run for governor, and he was a very prominent guy. He's sitting there in his kitchen working on his taxes. It's the 10th of April. Taxes are due the 15th. Oswald sets up his rifle and fires. Boom! It came in the window, but as it came through the window, it hit the very bottom of the top where you start to push it up, and it got deflected. And the bullet just went zip right over his head. Otherwise, it would have blown his head off. Oswald, after the first shot, doesn't know whether he hit him or not. I think he did. Hides it again, runs home, gets home, nothing on TV, nothing on radio. Just hears about it the next day. He realized that he missed. Went back a few days later and got the rifle and brought it back home. That was his first foray into shooting somebody prominent. Now he realizes Mr. Kennedy's going to come right by his window, literally. He's got 2 days' notice. He had been living in a rooming house in Dallas during the week and then going home to Fort Worth on the weekend to be with his wife, his daughter, Mrs. Payne, and the wife soon to have a baby. And that week, he had never done this before. He came on a Thursday night. He didn't drive, by the way, so he always needed to be driven, or he needed hitched a ride, or he had a friend that would drive him. They were shocked to see him. He'd never seen him on a Thursday night. He's very loving and attentive to his wife and daughter and everything. And when he gets up in the morning, he takes all the money he has, $170, leaves it on a tray with his wife, leaves his wedding ring, and has something that he tells the buddy that's driving him, who works with him at the school book depository. He said, "Oh, I have curtain rods here." In fact, it was the rifle that had been broken down. And he brings the rifle with him in the paper bag, in the curtain rod bag, and brings it in up to the 6th floor. How many have been to the 6th floor museum? Okay. And you know how he built up the boxes the way they have it built up now, make it a sniper nest so you couldn't see him from behind. His fingerprints were found all over those boxes. His palm print was found on the rifle ex post facto, and confirmed they knew what they were doing on fingerprints in the Dallas Police Department, and that also they could not find a palm print on the rifle at the FBI because it had been a complete lift, but they did agree that the others were his fingerprints. And so at 12:30, as the president is coming straight at him and then turns abruptly to go down Elm Street and then to go out Stemmons Freeway out to Trade Mart where he's going to speak, 3 shots ring out. First one misses. The second one hits both of them. And if you look at Zapruder super slow, and I've done that, you can see the effect of a hat being turned by Conley holding it, that is sequenced right with that bullet coming through the neck, out right here by his tie, right here, into Conley's shoulder, out his shoulder, under his right nipple here is the exit wound, and it's a jagged wound, but by that time the bullet's slower and it's tumbling. It goes down, smashes his wrists, and then just pricks the top of his knee in the skin there where his arm was being held. And then, of course, the third was the headshot. Now, the headshot. If you saw the movie JFK, if you've heard a lot of the critics, they've said, wait a minute. That had to come from the front because he was blown back and to the left. Back, you can hear the trial in the JFK movie going over that, 3 or 4 to back and to the left. Garrison, back and to the left, back and to the left. In fact, there's a phenomenon, and Michael Baden, who's probably the most famous still living, and Wecht is too, frankly, very senior forensic doc today, has done thousands of autopsies and knows medical wounds. It's what we call the jet effect. When the bullet came into the head from behind, and I've seen the autopsy pictures, there's a 6.5 millimeter, approximately, and it's beveled in right here in the head. And right here below the neck and to the right, a little hole like that, and it's beveled in. If you were to shoot a pistol out that window, and it went out clean, but it would bevel out, you could see the way the glass would be deformed. There'd be no question it came from inside. If it came from outside in here, you would see it would be beveled in. The glass would be beveled. There's no question about that. And so if you look at the beveling within the autopsy, they had concluded there were 2 shots. The autopsist, the primary one, Commander Humes, though, was confused because there's a big opening here in the neck. And they at first thought that was an entry wound. In fact, that was an exit wound, but had been torn apart by Malcolm Perry, Dr. Perry, to put a tracheostomy in and get the president breathing. When he arrived at the hospital, there was just agonal breathing. He had a pulse rate of 100. His eyes were bulging and fixated. He was dead. The headshot killed him. And you didn't have to be a forensic pathologist to say, yep, died of a headshot wound. It was so consequential. It blew this whole part of his head off. And how many have seen, probably we've all, or most of us have seen the film of that, right, of the headshot. Today, we're not like, we don't show anybody, and I understand it, anybody getting shot, except in the movies. But we see President Kennedy's head being literally blown off, and once it went in, then it avulses all of this cranial matter, brain tissue, bone, skin, out in such an effect, it actually pushes the head back and to the left. Now, what a lot of people don't realize or don't know, Mr. Kennedy, as we all know, had a bad back, right? He was in a metal corset that day, metal rods from under his armpits straight down the side, and then wrapped in tape around tightly to hold that in place. So when the first shot went in and hit both of them, Connolly literally collapses into his wife's arms, right? You don't see him anywhere. He's down below eye level, and she's holding him in his lap. Kennedy is over like this. Because he can't do that, he's supported by what he had underneath him. And that was what actually kept the head still prominent and placed as a shot of opportunity that Oswald took to put the headshot into the president. Now, when he first gets hit, and it comes through here, you see him go like this. Now, it's not like when we're little kids playing cops and robbers, you go bang, you go, oh, they got me, like that. In fact, and I've seen this up super slow-mo, he goes like this, okay? In other words, he's in a locked position. He's not holding this, he's not holding that, he's in a locked position. It's called the THOBURN, Thoburn position. It is a natural reaction of musculature with that type of shot. And you can see Mrs. Kennedy, she's grabbing, she's trying to get his arms down, but he's locked that way. And although this all happens quickly, it wasn't bang, 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 bang. It happened within 5 to 8 seconds, and they've shown that you're able to make those 3 shots because the first shot's already in the chamber. So you're going bang, bang, bang. You don't have to do it 3 times, just have to cock it 2 times. And so the only thing that releases this is the headshot, which destroys everything. Cortex, the brain's gone, and everything. Then he collapses. He's still like this when he bends over, comes over, because of the way he's structured underneath. But that's kind of the pathology and the history of what happened. In my judgment, that's the best evidence. So, a couple of words, and you can do this for hours, I know. A couple of words about Oswald and Ruby. Oswald never admitted to anything. Never admitted to anything. He never admitted to owning the rifle, the pistol. They had all that. By that, within a few hours, they had that nailed. And nope, not mine, no. They finally, I'm a patsy. And of course, they never do this today. The police in Dallas are running Oswald in a phalanx between reporters and anybody who wants to dang near be there, including Jack Ruby. They're given access like you'd never do today. And they're walking Oswald, again, as close as we are, to who knows who was there. Jack Ruby had owned a strip club right in downtown Dallas, had known police. He knew 400 or 500 policemen. He gave them free passes to the strip club. He'd buy liquor for them and stuff like that. And so he was a very known guy. And he would go where there was the action, and the police would be. And they'd let him hang around. So, and Ruby was, and you got to remember, the investigation they did, they looked at every phone call for and there's none of these, it's just your phone record. They look at everything they can in those days for months. Who was he talking to? Who was that person? I want to learn more about that. So they do everything that's possible. And Ruby was a guy with kind of like Oswald. He'd had a terribly hard upbringing, had been in an orphanage, was a fighter, was a guy who would get into fights, who would beat people. If he didn't like him in the club, he'd beat him up, throw him down the stairs of his club. I mean, he'd been arrested 9 times in the 10 years prior to the Kennedy assassination. But he was tolerated. He was a character. He was a known character. He took the shooting of Mr. Kennedy very hard, and he kept talking about how hard it must be on Mrs. and the kids. And he didn't want them to, he kept talking about this. And he never slept much. And during those 2.5 days, he only slept a couple hours a night. That was it. And so he had really built up this emotional anger against this guy who smirked a lot, okay? And people just, he'd smirk a lot, and boy, that would just send Jack off. And he was there in the station on Friday night when they paraded him around. At midnight, they had a press conference, and Henry Wade, who was the district attorney, said, well, this fellow was operating in the Free Cuba Committee. And from the back, you hear a voice. It's Jack Ruby. Henry, that's the Fair Play for Cuba Committee. You already found that out. Fair Play for Cuba Committee. This is Jack Ruby sitting there. And then you see, they took a lot of shots of them moving Oswald down and the press and everything. And all of a sudden, there's Jack Ruby just standing. You can't miss him. There's Ruby standing right in the middle of everything. So he was there constantly. Sunday morning, they announced they're going to move Oswald from the city jail to the county jail. They're going to do it at 10 in the morning. Jack does not get up till about 9:45, and he's asked by one of his strippers if he will go to Western Union and wire him $25 so she can pay her rent and get groceries. He agrees to do that. At 11:17, he was supposed to be moved at 10 o'clock, Ruby sends the money to this lady in Fort Worth. He walks out. It's only a half a block from the city jail. He sees all the commotion still going on down there. He walks down. And as far as they can tell, he just walked right down that driveway into the jail at the bottom, where everybody was, the press and everything, to witness the transfer of Lee Harvey Oswald. And as they bring Oswald out, the reason he was that late was he was being questioned by the FBI, by Captain Fritz, the homicide chief in Dallas, by the Secret Service, and by the Postal Service, because he had been using a lot of aliases and had fake post office boxes to receive guns and do things like that. And the guy who was the postal guy had called down to Fritz and said, I'm on my way to church, but I got to ask him some more questions. Can you hold him? I'm not going to go to church. I'm going to drop my wife off. I'm going to come down and I want to ask Oswald some questions. That was the biggest holdup from 10 to about 11:05. Then as they start to bring him down, remember, at the Western Union office, that's where Jack Ruby is till 11:17, right? When he sends that money. At the they decide, Oswald asked for a sweater. So they go to find a sweater, and that took another 10 or 12 minutes. And he gets the sweater, and they bring him down. And Ruby's right in the front, off to the right of the camera. And I was just out, again, I'm a freshman in college, and I worked washing dishes, so I just finished my washing dishes shift. And remember, it's an hour later up here in the east. And I'm out just past where I was working, looking at a black and white TV that's up in the corner, and they're showing the transfer of Ruby. And he gets shot, and he gets killed. And that created all kinds of, well, he was killed to silence him, blah, 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 blah. Yes, we'd have been better off for sure if Oswald had lived long enough. But remember, Oswald was in flight from the time Kennedy was shot. And he shot Tippit, the police officer, who was responding to a description that described Oswald, made by an eyewitness named Brennan, who was standing right up across the street, looking right up at the 6th floor window. And he described, as best you could from that vantage point, what Oswald looked like. and saw the rifle coming out. There's a number of other people who saw the rifle come out, but Brennan, that's what they broadcast at 1:15, and that was the description that they were relying on, and that Tippett was when he saw Oswald, a guy who looked just like this guy, walking down the street over near where he has his rooming house. And he stopped him, and boom, Tippett gets shot dead with 3 shots. So Oswald, with the gun that he had bought and that he owned, etc. So Oswald was clearly in flight. Now, one other thing, and one something brand new. You've probably seen on TV that a Secret Service agent, 60 years later, who was there that day, by the name of Paul Landis, who's 88 years of age, he has popped up and said, something I've been meaning to say about that. And he was on the backup car right behind the president's car, and he was on the outboard, and he was in the second. There were 2 on the outboards. He was the one furthest back. And on the other side from him was Clint Hill. Mr. Hill is still alive also. Clint Hill is 92 or 93. And both Landis and Hill knew each other real well within the service because they were the 2 that were assigned to Mrs. Kennedy. And Clint Hill had been Mrs. Kennedy's protector since the early 1962. He needed extra help. He brought Landis over so that he would also help in the protection of Mrs. Kennedy. And so they were very close. What he said, and I'm going to read it because I'm still scratching my head. And I want to be really careful here because I give every critic their due. They've thought it through. They have a view. Okay. And I haven't, said negative. I might have my own view, but haven't said negative about people. But Landis's book is 220 pages. Only 3 pages are about what he did and saw on the day of the assassination. But it did get him a great book contract. And by the way, it's really an interesting book. He first got hired in the Secret Service, taking care of David and Susan Eisenhower, Ike's grandkids. And then he was moved to after Kennedy gets elected, to the President's Protective Detail. He's a graduate of Ohio Wesleyan. He didn't know what he was going to do after school for 3 years, kind of bummed around. And a buddy of his was in the Secret Service, says, you ought to apply. And he did, and he was hired in 1959. And here we are in 1963. And he left the Secret Service 6 months later. There is no doubt about it. He was emotionally destroyed by witnessing and being there and seeing what he saw, the shots go in and afterwards. But let me read and I'm going to read a couple of things that he wrote here. The backup car comes right in after the president's car at Parkland. And he said, when Mrs. Kennedy finally stood up, I looked again at the seat and saw a bullet on top of the tufted black leather cushioning behind where she had been sitting. So to the left of her hip, kind of pushed back in the corner, was an almost intact bullet. He's really describing bullet 399, the so-called magic bullet. Okay? That's the only one he could be describing. And he said it was almost perfect, and that's true. That had only gone through soft tissue until it hit the bone, but wasn't going very fast at the end. And there was some lead that was out of the back side of it, but not much. And they were able to account on weight for what had gone out of it, what they found in Connolly, and what was no longer in the bullet. I picked it up and quickly examined it. It was approximately 2 inches long in almost perfect condition. It had rifle serrations running lengthwise along the sides. Man, oh man, I thought, what should I do? Seconds were ticking away. Things were moving fast. I had to make a quick decision. All sorts of thoughts and what-ifs are running through my mind. Bullet fragments, which I had seen and left there, and now a completely intact bullet. This was important. The Vice President limo had yet to arrive. No agents from the detail in sight. Here I am alone. My concern was with the bullet. It would be visible to anyone happening to walk by. How about photographers? Worse, a souvenir hunter. Thoughts continued to race. So what did I do? I picked it up and slipped it into my right suit coat pocket. He then goes into the melee that was trying to take care of the president, all the docs in the operatory room that they were in, 60 people trying to fit into a space that maybe 30 fitted, okay? And it was bedlam, as you can imagine. He proceeds to take the bullet out of his pocket in the middle of all this bedlam, standing right at the, according to him, at the president's feet, with all those people there. And he puts it on the exam table next to the president's left shoe, okay? And then he said it started to roll. And he said, if this rolls off, it's going to make a noise, what am I going to do? Now, admittedly, there's bedlam there. And 30 people can be in bedlam and something happened and nobody saw it, you know? But bedlam, that's what he's saying, that's what he's claiming. He said, but the shoe had made a little, there was a cloth that was over the metal, and it was raised a little bit, and I slipped it back into that, okay? Now, late that afternoon and the next day, they asked the Secret Service folks to write what they saw, what happened, what they did, and this was very important. And the Secret Service folks were used to doing that. They wrote reports every day about what they had done that day in their protection. He never mentioned the bullet. Never. It was not mentioned until he wrote this book 60 years later. And so he got a book contract. And as I said, it's kind of a fun book to read about Mrs. Kennedy, about the Eisenhowers, and he seemed to be a fine gentleman. But all I do is, I cannot, with all that I've done and looked at, studying what happened here, I cannot account for a fully clad bullet being found in the back seat of the presidential limousine next to Mrs. Kennedy. I don't know what to say about that. I don't. And most people who have looked at it are now dead. I mean, so much has gone on. A lot of these people aren't around anymore. So it may be the last word, but I can't fit it in. That's all I can tell you. I can't fit it in. So the summary is as follows. Sadly, Kennedy, of course, was tragically killed. It was an awful assassination. And a lot of folks hung back a little bit. Let's see, the FBI. They did all the investigations, but they knew about Oswald. And Oswald had sent a very nasty note to one of their agents, telling him to quit bothering his wife and reviewing him. And the day after Oswald was killed, they took that note and they tore it up and threw it away, threw it down the toilet. You don't ever do that. That is very important evidence, and that got found out. So that, the FBI, and J. Edgar Hoover, his world and his life was to make sure everybody looked great, and they were doing a lot. They were generally doing a lot. He disciplined 17 of his FBI agents for not handling it correctly, very quietly. Some guys wound up in Tucumcari, New Mexico, and others in Kansas City. I mean, there's different ways that Mr. Hoover could handle that. The CIA, Allen Dulles, who headed the CIA, is on the Warren Commission. Do you think it would be relevant if the Warren Commission knew that in the time leading almost up to Kennedy's assassination, that we were literally trying to kill Castro? Lyndon Johnson said, they were running a damn murder incorporated down there in Cuba. He always thought Castro had quite a bit to do with it. The mafia. Robert Kennedy had made it awful hard on organized crime, notwithstanding that his father had worked with a lot of, I'm not just making this one up, a lot of organized crime guys during the liquor running Mr. Kennedy made a lot of money during Prohibition, where Kennedy had a direct relationship with Sam Giancana, the head of the mob in Chicago, and had a relationship between Giancana and Mayor Daley. And remember, the state of Illinois, out of 4.7 million votes, Kennedy won that by 9,000. And Daley promised that they would get him enough votes to win on election day. We go through this more lately, right? There were some real serious questions about Illinois and Texas. Texas, 46,000 votes, 2.3 million voted in Texas. 46,000 votes separated Mr. Nixon from Mr. Kennedy. and Texas was very famous. 1941, when Lyndon Johnson, as a member of the House, ran for the United States Senate, he made a critical mistake. He announced that he had enough votes to win 2 days after the election. But Coke Stevenson, who was the governor running for the Senate, now he knew how many more votes he needed to win. Stevenson beat him. 1948, LBJ runs again. Abe Fortas, when they were on the Supreme Court, was LBJ's lawyer. LBJ didn't say how many he had, and he won by 68 votes. And a lot of votes came in Duval County in a trash can that was carried by the Duke of Duval, a guy who was in charge of the party down there. So there were some questions that were going on. To Mr. Nixon's credit, he decided not to contest for the good of the country, and he agreed to Joe Kennedy, who called Mr. Nixon. Joe Kennedy loved Richard Nixon. Joe Kennedy gave him a lot of money when he ran for the Senate in 1950 against Helen Hagan Douglas. Joe Kennedy was very anti-communist. He loved the things that Mr. Nixon did. And he convinced Nixon to fly on the Caroline down to Florida and have lunch with Jack. And so they could shake hands and everybody would feel good about things, which Nixon did, again, to his credit. So that was the question. The mafia definitely had some reasons, and of course we've heard that if you're dealing with a snake, you don't hit the tail, that's Bobby, you hit the head, that takes care of the tail, and that was Jack Kennedy. But most of these things, people always have reasons to do things, but are they going to do things? Because the consequences of being caught, if you're Cuba or Russia or somebody else, are awful, consequentially. And remember, Russia, Kennedy, I had a great opportunity. One of the most interesting opportunities in my life was to have a long lunch with Ted Sorensen, who was Mr. Kennedy's great aide and speechwriter. And the year before he died, I was at a conference, and Mr. Sorensen was there, and I talked to him about my favorite Kennedy speech, which was his commencement address at American University on the 10th of June, 1963, when he talked about the consequences of Russia and America, that we all had the same children, we all breathed the same air, we all wanted to be free, but we had to look out for what was after us. So we should, have détente, do some things more together. And out of that, they got the first nuclear above-ground test ban treaty signed 2 months later in Pitsunda, when Dean Rusk went over and signed it on behalf of the United States. So the relationships with the Soviets was really getting better. It started really under Kennedy, and then really carried forward a little bit with Johnson, but definitely with Nixon and then into Ford. Again, this is back in those days. You can't judge things by today. You have to judge things in the time in which they were occurring. So a lot of the folks who had motive, let's say, or anger, wouldn't have done it. So I can't fit in this latest, and if I'm here 10 years from now at 88 years of age, didn't think I'd be here at 78 talking about this. Last time I did this was 50 years ago. It was the 50th anniversary, and I did it for about 1,000 people. And it went 2.5 hours because lots of questions, which I'm about to take, by the way. And look forward to your questions. Thank you very much.